Hi, everyone. Thanks, Susan, for that wonderful introduction, and good evening, everybody. I'm very excited to be presenting here for the University of Florida's Wildlife Forensic Science and Conservation Program, and especially for Susan Underkloffer's class. We're going to take a look at the conservation detection dog method tonight, and thank you so much for having us. To kind of the meat of this presentation and the philosophy on teaching dogs and their handler counterparts, I want to tell you just a little bit about rogue detection teams. We are a conservation detection dog program based out of Eastern Washington near Spokane. Even though we're based out of Washington, we do work all over the United States and often outside and internationally in other countries. We adopt kind of these misfit or unwanted dogs from rescues and shelters that are kind of on their last options in life. A lot of them have developed destructive or aggressive behaviors due to their amount of energy. The one thing we look for in them is this insatiable desire to play fetch, and that allows us to communicate, which we'll get into a little bit later. And then we teach them to help us locate data on rare or cryptic odors. And then when they find that, they're rewarded with their favorite game of fetch. These teams are a method used to collect data on challenging research species. And while it's a small kind of field at the moment, it's growing very quickly. And just really quickly to introduce our pack, we have 2 awesome administrators, 7 back-breaking bounders, and 14 tenacious teachers, that being the dogs. You can see, if you just take a look real quickly, there's quite a variety in breeds, different sizes, and we'll look at a few of these a little bit closer as we move along. So what is it we do? Well, most of our work is field work. And we spend anywhere from 6 to 9 months of the year going from project to project with our canine counterparts. This is our full-time job. So when we're not in the field, we're developing methodologies for detecting new species. As this field grows, we're asked to sniff out more cryptic targets, from invisible viruses that are affecting different tree species to maybe where bats have landed briefly for a moment that'll end up helping researchers determine where hibernaculums will be later in the year, or finding a species that hasn't been detected in the wild for the last 40 years. And we'll talk about some of these in a little bit. We also assist researchers and organizations either for how to use the method itself, how to use dog teams appropriately, or for developing their own dog programs. It's not easy running a detection dog program, and with daily care and vet bills, it's a side of the work that we strive to help the community learn from what we've already developed. A big part of what we also do is teach new handlers, or what we call bounders. And this will be kind of the focus on part of this presentation later. And then, as I shared just in the last slide there, we really focus on adopting and finding jobs and a life for these fetch obsessed dogs that are generally would have been scheduled to be euthanized. And lastly, as the methodology grows, we hope to start hosting classes that at our headquarters here in Washington that explore the detection dog communication, and if things work out, we may be working with the University of Florida on this. And just quickly, I want to give you an idea of what all the dogs can smell. They can detect scat, toxins and virus, rare and invasive plants, carcasses, live animals, and marine wildlife. And this is just a quick kind of summary of all the different things that are out there that they can work on. And we're just kind of touching the surface now. Of course, there's all sorts of therapy dogs and cancer detection dogs, and I mean, dogs are doing just about everything now. But this is generally what we focus on as rogue detection teams. So we touched on rogues a bit there and who we are. Now we're going to jump into the meat of the presentation, aptly titled here, Keep It Simple. This is our philosophy on developing detection dog teams for conservation work. And the title is really important, and it's something I want you to keep in mind through the presentation. because we're going to get into quite a bit of complicated and different things, but at the root of all of this is keeping it simple and focusing on that communication with the dogs. Well, as field biologists, we're passionate about wildlife conservation, and what led us to this field specifically is the tremendous amount of data that we can collect with these teams in a non-invasive manner, and especially when we're working with endangered and threatened species. And non-invasive means that we rarely, if ever, see the species we're surveying for. And while we may be out there and moving through the environment, the dogs wear bear bells to let wildlife know we're in there. We try to minimize any contact we would have with the species at all. It's an unbiased method as well because the dogs are really just focused on finding these samples so they can play ball. They don't care if it's a male or a female, if it's young or old, if it's on the trail or off the trail, what it ate or anything like that. They just want to find the sample so they can play ball. It's very adaptable and kind of multifaceted in that we can teach our dogs to find many different odors at once, or while we're doing a survey. This could be anything from 9 or 10 different species of scat that we're looking for, to doing a little bit of scat work, finding some rare and invasive plants at the same time, or looking for carcasses. It's not just that the dogs have to be doing scat and or something else. They're able to do it all. And with this method, the dogs can cover. They'll generally cover about 20 to 30 and sometimes even 40 kilometers in a day, depending on the breed and how fast and young they are and what the understory is like. But the point being, they can cover a huge amount of area with us, and we're going up and down ridge lines and crossing rivers and streams, and everywhere we need to go, they're able to go along with us. And then lastly, the reason this works for us is because the dogs have this just insane fixation to play fetch. And so the only thing that really matters to them when we go out is play. And they're doing, this isn't a job so much for them as it is play. And so they're looking for all of these different odors just so we can play ball for a little bit. And they love it. They love it so much. You'd think they'd be tired at the end of the day, but a lot of times we have to actually put a leash on them to get them to go to the car and say, okay, well, we're going to rest for the rest of the day and we'll come back out tomorrow. How do we teach the dogs to find these different odors? How do we teach people to work with these dogs and traipse around the remote wilderness areas? As you can see here, teaching the dogs is the easy part, and that's kind of it may be a bit misleading in that we have 20 years of experience. So yes, now it's very easy for us to select the appropriate dogs. We know what we're looking for, and we know how to communicate that to them. It doesn't necessarily mean that someone starting out is going to have an easy time teaching the dog. But with our experience at this point, it takes us maybe half a day to introduce an odor to the dog. And this is a dog coming straight from the shelter. And then after that, layering on other odors is as little as 5 minutes. Now that's kind of a double-edged sword in that it may be really easy and great to add on odors, but that also means you can just as easily accidentally add on odors you're not interested in, and those are what we call non-targets. Now, a lot of that non-target issue stems from the people side of that, which is, as you can see here, the much more challenging side. So if we kind of take the idea that it takes us about half a day to teach the dog to do this, you might be surprised to know it takes about 2 years to teach a person how to do this. And that doesn't mean, you can't learn the basics, and learning the basics takes about 2 months. But even with that, the basics that a person learns, it really requires someone to kind of dive into this. And at around the 2-year mark, they'll kind of hit this plateau of where they're really starting to understand stuff. Now, being in this for 20 years, I continue to learn stuff every day. The dogs, as you saw in some of our opening slides there, they are our teachers, and by listening to them and observing what they're doing, that's how we really learn. This is a pretty fun slide, and we're just going to take a quick look at Jennifer and Scooby here in Africa in a project they were working on. First, what we want to point out is, again, well, I'll keep saying this, but the odor equals the ball. So Scooby is probably finding a cheetah scat here, and Jennifer has the ball ready and to reward him. Now, while they were in Africa, Scooby was searching for simultaneously for 10 different odors, and that means as they're out on their cell that they're surveying, they're looking for a number of different predator species. They're also looking for carcasses from those different species. They're looking for carcasses of these species or other species that may have been killed or poached, and they're also looking for snares where traps have been laid that are going to lead to poaching, and they're able to provide all of this data to the researcher. So there's no limit to what we can teach the dogs to find for us. And just because Scooby was only doing 10 odors here doesn't mean he couldn't have done more. In his career, Scooby worked on over 40 different odors. And you may read in some books that dogs can only do like 14 odors. It's not true. Again, the nice thing about the dogs is if you're able to communicate correctly with them and interpret what they're communicating to you, you can avoid things like a non-target scat that may be a species you're not interested in, and that'll save a great deal of funds later on in the analysis portion of the project. So one of the things we really like to do is not just talk about all the great things that this method provides. We like to talk about the real side of it too. There's a huge financial investment of finding the right dogs, training them, teaching the handlers. A lot of handlers don't make it, so you lose financially. You'll lose what you've invested in those people because they're going to stop progressing at the level you want. There's the time for the instruction. There's the ongoing need for the reliability and fluency, and what that means is as teams progress and you're collecting this data, you need every team to be reliable, or the data you're collecting is not going to be as useful, or if at all. As you can imagine, there's significant dog care and maintenance responsibilities, everything from vet bills to the amount of dog food that you have to buy, especially if you want to maintain a healthy dog, you need to purchase really great dog food. And we put a lot of research into what dog food companies we do purchase for the dogs. And then DNA analysis for if we go out and we're collecting samples from 10 different species, say, and you do that over 2 months, you're looking at thousands of samples. And for each of those samples, you may be looking at anywhere from $30 to $100 in lab costs, and that financially that adds up quickly. And generally what happens is researchers hire us to go and find stuff, and then we find so many samples they won't need to hire us again for another 5 years, and they're kind of overwhelmed with everything. The detection rate, I mentioned this just a little bit earlier in the reliability, but this has to be really considered, because if you're working in certain environments, the scats you may be finding or the samples may not be useful. So even though you're putting in that effort out there and collecting things, that you may not be getting data back from it. And if teams vary greatly, if you send out one team and they're finding 15 scats a day and another team is only finding one, that can really skew the data. And so that skew is generally based on the bounder's behavior influencing the dog, and we'll talk about some special cases of that here in a little bit. Focusing on research and wanting to try to make a difference in this conservation field. So our field work and collecting that raw data is only the first step. After our teams collect this data, it's time for it to be analyzed, and samples are sent to various genetic labs around the world, depending on the info or the species that the researchers are focusing on. And this will be done to look at species, diet, sex, reproduction, hormones, toxins, and a whole host of other things that we're able to get from these different scats. After that, the analysis starts to take place, and this can take several months to a year to compile and work through all of this data that's been collected and what kind of effect it's showing us, either from an environmental standpoint or from management standpoints. And then the next work kind of step in that is writing this up and publishing the work so it can be in peer-reviewed scientific journals and help other managers and researchers continue on with this work. And so we're just one small step in this long list of actions that kind of take place. And from the time we collect data, it may be 2 to 5 years before we start to see it published in research papers. Oh, okay. So now we're going to get into kind of the fun side of stuff and also maybe the frustrating side of stuff. This is myself and one of our new bounders, Sarah, who's working down in Palm Springs on a wind facility. Teaching bounders is by far one of the hardest things I've ever done, and it continues to be. And I just want to go through kind of how we have developed this. It might be a little different than the normal route for things. First off, our method, there's no failures, there's no mistakes. These are only opportunities. So every time when you're in training and something goes wrong, that's a chance for you as a bounder to learn from it. So the idea behind our philosophy of teaching folks is let's try to provide as many opportunities as we can while you're in training. So when you go to the field, you have that experience kind of to look back on. And that's not always the most positive thing for someone coming to learn, in that you try to set them up to, and even though there's no failures, you're trying to set them up to have these failures so they have the opportunity to learn from it. And that can be somewhat defeating to people when they feel like they aren't progressing. And it's not until well after kind of graduating that they can look back on it and start to see, okay, yeah, I see why this was so valuable now. In addition to that, while we generally try to use as much daylight as we can to get out there and actually be with the dogs, but there's also homework assignments. And this is to start helping people to think about how things, look at it from a different point of view, to look at it from kind of the dog's point of view rather than a human's point of view. And that might be reading scientific papers that are out there and discussing those. It might be essay questions. It might be watching videos of yourself work or someone else work, which also kind of leads into the next one, which is observing your peers work. When folks start into this field, there's a million things they're kind of faced with and they have to think about. And the best analogy I can make is when you're learning to drive a car. When you're first, getting into the car, you're worried about everybody else on the road. You're worried about stop signs and traffic lights and turn lanes, and if you're going to brake soon enough. It's hard now for us to probably remember what it was like when we had to learn to drive a car, but hopefully we can all remember it wasn't the easiest thing. Yet after you learn to drive a car, and maybe months or years later, we don't even think about driving anymore. A lot of times I'll even forget that I was driving and I'm home and I don't remember the last 5 or 10 miles I drove, but because I was daydreaming about something else. Maybe I'm not the safest driver, I don't know. But the point is, that's kind of how this method is. You're hyper focused on everything when you're in training, but over the years, you and the dog, you really develop this kind of, it's almost like a telepathy, but this connection where when you're out there, the dog's just an extension of yourself and you're an extension of the dog, and you work together. So the point of this observing the peers is that since you're so freaked out when it's your turn to work the dog or something, and you're worried about every little thing you're going to do, and you're worried about me, saying you made a mistake or whatever, or found another opportunity, you have the opportunity to watch other people work. And so when you're watching someone else work, it gives you the opportunity to see what they're doing and allows your brain to start thinking about, okay, this is what I need to do. Now, generally, the way this works out is somebody's watching someone else work. They point out all the things that that person needs to work on, and then when it's their turn, they find those same opportunities for themselves to work on. And so the end goal ends up being hopefully to give people an additional opportunity to think about these things, but also to realize that they're gonna have a difficult time here in the beginning learning the process of all this and thinking about every little thing. But that's okay. As long as someone wants to continue that path and does want to do this, then they'll come out the other side of it and they'll have a huge amount of experience to back them up. Moving on, I tend to ramble a bit sometimes too much. Group discussion. I don't think there's anything better than sitting down as a group and just talking about different ideas and thinking. One of the frustrating things for students that are in our classes is that they'll have questions, and kind of my style is when someone asks a question, I ask them, well, what would you do in this situation? I want to know how you're approaching this and what you're thinking about before we talk through an answer. I don't like to give people answers. I like to help them learn how to get to that answer. And that can understandably that can often be frustrating when folks want a manual or they want certain steps to do this and they just want to memorize it. This field is not like that. Every dog you work with is going to be different. Every species is different. Every day you go out is going to be different. The environment's going to affect where you're working. We work in, maybe one time we might be on a project that's down in Palm Springs in a desert. The next thing we're in cornfields in Ohio. And the next thing we're up in Alaska in a temperate rainforest. It's just it changes so much daily that there is no specific way to do this. And to help drive that home, we do have folks learn kind of through by immersion with working but with different dogs, which is also frustrating. Folks will say, let me just focus on one dog and learn it, and then I'll learn a new dog. Well, that makes sense in our human brains. But what we're actually wanting to teach people to do is communicate with dogs in general, not just a particular dog. And so when they arrive here, they may end up working 5 different dogs the first day, and then another 5 different dogs the next day, and rotating through those 10 or 15 dogs over the next month. We don't allow people to focus on one dog until they really start to grasp how they're communicating to the dog and what the dogs in general are communicating back to them. Now, the last step of the teaching process is what we call a shadow program. And this is for folks to have the opportunity to go out and have some freedom and independence to figure out where they're having trouble, come back, and we go out together. So a mentor would go out with them, and during the day, maybe the mentor will work half the time, and then the other time the student will work half the time. And that allows them the mentor to show them different things. It also allows the student to have someone there to answer questions kind of on the fly of what's happening, or for the mentor to point out what's happening. So I realize this is probably showing up now, but Pips is here with me, and he has a bone that he's gnawing on at the moment. So the scraping noise that you probably continue to hear through this presentation is actually Pips. And so this leads into what we look for in a bounder, and it's one of those things is patience. So you're never not on the job, kind of. The dogs are always with you, and you're always having to look out for their well-being. And this people may kind of think of this like, oh, I've had a pet before, I know what it's like to take care of a dog. This is a level different than that, and it's probably something you're not going to be able to understand until you're in it. But these are these are insane dogs, and I say that in the nicest way. But these are the dogs that have so much energy you don't know what to do with it. And I'm not talking about just when they're a puppy or when they're 2 or 3 years old. These are dogs that have this insane energy until 12, 13, 14 years old, and they're still working in the field. So when you have something that's this driven or this so focused on playing ball, you really have to have a certain amount of patience. And along with that patience, I kind of put these on both ends here because they're two of the most important things: is patience and empathy. And even though I'm skipping to the bottom here for a minute, empathy is being able to have that patience and then understand kind of that the dog's dealing with that, and how to communicate to them, how to take a step back and keep yourself grounded, and which now leads into a bit of that self-awareness. Grounded so you can communicate in a manner that the dogs can understand and really thrive on. Now, two other parts of what we look for that are extremely important in a bounder, and are somewhat a bit opposing in personalities, are a critical thinking side of things. So having a very analytical look at things and trying to figure out why certain things are happening. At the same time, you also need this kind of innate intuition that allows you to kind of take in everything at once and have an idea, or have the knowledge to, what if I try this, or what is this what's happening, or and it's really hard to explain. But these are two extremely important things, and the reason they're important is in that if we hire somebody and they're looking at this as a job of just going out and doing their work, and some people think, okay, the dog's going to collect, they're going to find scats, I collect it, I record the data, that's it, I'm done. It's for this method to be as powerful as it can be, there's a lot more to it, and you're working alongside that dog. You're not just following that dog. You're not just a handler. And that's one of the reasons that we have switched the name to Bounder, because you're bound to this dog. You're bound to the method. You're bound to conservation. But that bond that you share with the dog is that you're not just following along and picking up poop, or marking something on a phone. You're helping that dog read the different wind variables. You're looking for samples as well. You know all the things about the different species. But I think I'm going to talk a bit more about that here in this slide. This really gets into the skills that folks need to develop as they progress in this field. First and foremost is learning to read the wind, and basically environmental conditions in different terrains. And the reason that's important is that for the dogs to find an odor, to locate a sample, they have to be able to detect that odor, and that's what we call an odor cone. When the wind blows from a sample, it creates a cone across the environment where that odor is detectable. And our job is to basically look at a landscape and think, okay, this is predominant where the wind's coming from. This is where it's moving. This is how trees are affecting it, or rocks, or rivers, or valleys. This is how, what time of day it is, and the sun's like this. It's this time of year. The air temperature is higher or cooler. And then in addition to that, another reason that's so important is that we have to intimately know the species we're tasked with finding. And this might be 10 to 15 different species in a certain environment, and some may be animals, some may be plants, but we have to know all of that, and we have to know where those species may be moving through the environment, but not only moving, where they may prefer to deposit scats. A lot of animals like to do this potentially cryptically, maybe burying scats, so that we have to consider that. And then we have to think about home ranges. If it's if it's a transient that's moving through the environment where we're going to find all of this knowledge about these different species becomes extremely important, because it's our job to help put the dogs in the right place at the right time. Now, in addition to that, there's also first aid. We're working remotely. We do have a satellite communication device, so if we do get hurt, we can send out an SOS. But we also have to be very careful with the dogs. They may, in their kind of drive to find samples, they may get into wasp nests. They may run into a stick and puncture something. They can tear pads, and that sometimes we may even run into things like rattlesnakes or like wild boars, where we have to be very careful and make sure the dogs are safe. Now, excuse me. Now, we spend weeks to months to sometimes even year in the backcountry, kind of alone with just the dog, and that may sound, romantically, that may sound like a lot of fun, and I'll admit I do enjoy that part of it, but that can also be really debilitating to folks that aren't used to that. There is no cell phone, there's no TV to watch at night. You very rarely get to talk with your friends or your family, and it may be hard to find time to actually go home and visit, and you miss weddings, and all of that starts to wear on a person over time. In addition to kind of all of that stress, there's also the fact we wear many different hats when we're not in the field. And so this may be answering emails or building web pages or maintenance around the facility. There's never a shortage of things to do, and it feels like you're never getting far enough, but there's always something else. And then on the plus side, I like to throw this that we forever roam the boundaries on the edge of civilization. This is definitely a plus to the work, being out there and being in places with this canine counterpart, and seeing things that no one else really sees. It's an incredible opportunity. So let's talk a little bit about how to communicate with the detection dog. And in this, as I've mentioned, this is probably the most difficult aspect of my job and or my lifestyle, but it's also one of the most important. With this method, growing as rogues, we really want to help other people do this, and we want to teach them the way if they're interested, the way we do it, because it's for lack of a better word, it's magical. And we've already talked a bit about Bounder and the difference of why we don't call ourselves canine handlers anymore. And the reason that we're kind of focusing on words here right at the beginning is, before we even start working with the dogs, we need to think about thinking differently, thinking about how we change the way our brain works, and understanding the connotations of certain words. And I think a really good example of this is training versus teaching. For training, at least in the dog world, or even for sports and stuff, we definitely train here. We have exercises we run. We work on things with the dogs. But in the sense of training, there's clicker training, there's obedience training, and a lot of times the idea of training is associated with we say or go through these steps, and the dog has to do what we say. We don't do that here, and we don't really subscribe to that as much. What we really try to focus on is teaching the dogs what we want, and then the reward is going to be to play. Now, this is important for a number of reasons, because we want the dogs to, just like we want just like we want the bounders to do, is to think critically. We want the dogs to be able to problem solve for us in the field. And sometimes when you train a dog to do a certain thing, they can become a bit of a robot, because they've been shaped to provide these certain behaviors for you. We allow the dog to kind of be its natural self, and through that, if it wants to play, it finds these things for us, and that hopefully that explains it a little bit. Another example is working a dog versus working with a dog. This may seem, again, kind of superficial, but it's important to start to think about the things you say and the power behind those words. We don't just work a dog. It's not just a tool that we're taking out there and using for that little bit of time. We work with a dog, and honestly, we live with a dog. We have our dogs from the time we rescue them in the shelter to the time they move on, and pass away. And that a lot of times that, we have two dogs right now that are 18, and just recently retired to a more relaxed lifestyle. But there's still, we're, for lack of a better word, we're married to these dogs, for their life, and it's an important part of what we do. Now, tying into that, even though we're married to them, there's a lot of confusion for folks, that come into this field between what a bond is versus perhaps a teammate or a coworker. And generally what it is folks enter the program and they think they have to bond with the dog before it will work with them. That you have to necessarily gain their trust, or you have to cuddle with them, or they have to sleep in the bed with you, or you have to give them a bunch of treats and then they'll listen to you. That's not the case. When we get a new dog from a shelter that we don't know, sometimes we can go right to work with them. And the reason for that is because of communication. And for folks that go through this program to the other side that have had pets before, generally what you'll hear them say is, I thought I knew, my pet dog, and now I'm realizing there's so much that they were communicating to me that I never realized, that is now so obvious. And it's literally like learning another language. And when you're trying to teach somebody this language that they've never heard before or can see, it's almost, like a magic trick or something. The point being, it's really hard for people to see something that they're not able to see, and it takes time. So what does it mean to problem solve? And we're going to look at things from grasshoppers to whales to bat hibernaculums to different viruses to caterpillars, to illegal wildlife products, and and elusive endangered species, cryptic species. So what this whole problem solving, motif through this presentation is kind of really where this is all led to. We want the handlers to be able to problem solve, to have that analytical and intuitive side to themselves, but we also want the dogs to have that. And in training dogs, you can really take that away from them, because dogs as a species perhaps are so focused on wanting to kind of please us, that we generally have to, in a certain sense, rewild our dogs a bit when we get them from a shelter, because shelters are amazing nowadays. They do a lot of clicker training. They're working very hard to assimilate all their rescues into a home environment, and we're not quite a home environment. We're gonna I could talk for hours, and we're gonna run out of things, but let's focus a minute on grasshoppers. And this is a project that was taking place over in France. This is one of our international bounders, Rita Santos, and her dog Hera, and they were looking for this very cryptic. And if you look in the bottom right there, you may be able to pick out the grasshopper. This is a very cryptic grasshopper in very tall grass that I can attest to is extremely hard to see, and it's a threatened species. So over there, what would happen is this is a live species, which we don't work with a whole lot, but in this case we are. Hera would detect the odor from the cricket, and as a cricket's running away from a predator, it'll leave a large amount of odor. Generally, it expels some waste as it hops away, and so the predator is more focused on where the grasshopper was than where the grasshopper is. And Hera would point out spots to us, and we weren't able to find the grasshopper, and Hera would be like, well, it was right here, but we couldn't reward her because we need to find the grasshopper. And so kind of through our approach, Hera was able to, on her own, realize that if I smell this grasshopper and I get too close, it's going to hop away. And if it hops away, I need to be able to show Rita where it's hopped to. So what Hera would do is she would detect the grasshopper, sit back for a second, make sure it wasn't going to hop away, and then have Rita come over and take a look. If the grasshopper did move, she would watch to see where it went and refocus her alert to, this is where the grasshopper is now, Rita. And then Rita's able to come over and take a look. We didn't teach Hera to do that. That was something she learned on her own. And there you go. I'm sure you already picked it out, but in the bottom right, you can see that grasshopper. I have lots of other stories I'd love to tell about the dogs. Things from what happens when they're working on different species and the amazing things they've taught me and other folks in our program. But I do want to make sure we leave enough time for questions. For those looking to learn more about this method, Jennifer, one of our bounders, recently co-authored a chapter in the textbook edited by Susan and Dr. Adams there at the University of Florida. This chapter takes a deeper dive into many of the concepts that we've talked about today. It's not a how-to manual. It's not going to teach you how to work with these dogs. Again, that takes a lot of effort. But it's the aim of the paper itself, or the chapter, was to provide a really thought-provoking conversation into the role that conservation detection dog teams take in ecological monitoring. And I'd really encourage you to take a look at it. It's probably part of your class already, I would assume. If you'd like to learn more about Rogue Dogs itself, you can visit our website at roguedogs.org. We're always eager to answer questions or to continue discussions. You can reach out to us at contact@roguedogs.org. There's a number of different papers, podcasts, publications, and presentations that you can watch. Jennifer does an incredible job on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, sharing the different philosophies that we kind of adhere to and what the work is like. I'd highly encourage you to follow those. And then lastly, we have a YouTube channel where you can search for rogue detection teams and watch other presentations we've given. I just want to say thank you very much to Susan and Dr. Adams for having us here to speak with the Wildlife Forensics and Conservation Department, and thank you from Rogue Detection Teams. And with that, we should have about 18 minutes for questions. And I just quickly, I'll introduce Pips too. That's Pips there in the background sitting with me, who's also here sitting with me, providing the nice bone scraping noises. And if we don't have questions, I have plenty of stories I can share. But please feel free to let me know any questions you might have. Thank you.